Any lecture on the crisis of liberty in the West faces at least one serious limitation, time. And as I'm the last thing that stands between you and your dinner, I know time is in short supply. As is liberty. For the crisis of liberty in the West is expansive, multifaceted, and more deeply rooted than many of our political slogans suggest. Passing through airport security to fly for this conference served as one reminder of the threat radical Islamic terrorism poses to liberty. Bankrupt nations such as Greece and cities such as Detroit offered vivid examples of the role that government debt plays in fettering freedom for ourselves and our children. Governments that regulate more aspects of our lives, frequently through unaccountable bureaucrats, be they at the European Union, the United Nations, or the United States Department of Health and Human Services, also threaten our liberty. I needn't spend any more time on these concerns, as they're common examples bandied about in discussions such as these. Many Westerners feel that the system is rigged against them, that elites despise the values of ordinary people, that political correctness prevents us from naming and thus combating our enemies, that technocrats in Brussels, Geneva, or Washington know better, and thus we needed a radical change to get things back on track. Witness support for Brexit and Trump. These sorts of concerns are among the standard issue economic, political, and security threats to liberty. But underlying all of them is a deeper threat with deeper roots, an anthropological and spiritual crisis. Look to the empty pews, the Western European churches turned into museums or mosques. The American churches turned into little more than social clubs with choirs. Look to the opioid and other drug epidemics in America. Look to the historically unprecedented rates of men simply dropping out of the workforce. Look to similarly unprecedented rates of family breakdown, non-marital childbearing, and divorce. Look to the widespread belief that there is no truth, certainly no moral truth. The deepest crisis of liberty in the West, then, as I see it, is a crisis of moral freedom. Freedom today is understood as a freedom of indifference, a freedom from constraint. But freedom, rightly understood, is a freedom for excellence. We once knew that the most important freedom was freedom from slavery to sin and for virtue. This was a belief once common and rather obvious to great Greek and Roman philosophers, as well as Jewish and Christian theologians. And it now seems incomprehensible to modern Western man, who can't even understand the concept of slavery to the passions, to our ungoverned appetites. We no longer know what the West once knew, that the most important freedom is the freedom for excellence, for living in accordance with truth. It's the loss of this conviction and how it intersects with more frequently stated concerns about liberty that I want to explore in tonight's lecture. So let me give you an idea of what's to come. The lecture comes in two parts. The first half is critical, and the second half, hopefully, is constructive. And each of those halves come in three thirds, I guess, three sub-halves. So in the critical half, I discuss challenges to freedom in terms of, first, bad intellectual defenses of economic freedom, second, collapsing communities, and then third, cronyism. In the constructive half, I first discuss a natural law account of economic freedom, second, a natural law account of social justice, and then third and finally, I close with some thoughts about anthropology and virtue. So I begin with intellectual challenges to liberty. Bad defenses of freedom that don't see it as for something allow people to undermine freedom and ignore how important it is. This is especially the case when it comes to economic freedom. Consider the recent election in the United States. The last three major candidates standing, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders, hardly even paid lip service to the importance of economic freedom. Part of this is likely the result of weak intellectual defenses of market freedoms that have traditionally been offered. The two most common are some form of Lockean self-ownership natural right and some form of utilitarianism. And so allow me to simplify things for rhetorical effect. The first way of defending economic freedom goes something like this. Economic freedom just is a demand of justice. That's it. It's axiomatic that liberty is a starting point, including economic liberty. Now, Locke himself tried to ground this right in self-ownership, but others, sensing that this grounding ultimately fails, have rested content to defend what one scholar has called natural rights without foundations. That is, they simply take it as a starting point that human beings have an unlimited, unconditional natural right to economic freedom. It strikes me that this defense is flawed for at least two reasons. First, it isn't true. Economic liberty, like liberty in general, is not an intrinsic good. It's an instrumental good at the service of intrinsic goods. And thus, rights to economic freedom are both grounded in and limited by the demands of justice and the common good, rightly understood. The real economic freedom rights we possess are limited, not unlimited, conditioned, not unconditional. An argument that says all taxation is theft, for example, simply tries to prove too much. And of course, no argument for natural rights without foundations has been able to explain why anyone has a duty to respect natural rights. So second, not only is this account not true, it's not persuasive. And it's not persuasive precisely in the respects in which it isn't true. That is, people find it unpersuasive that there's a natural right to economic freedom, even when respecting such a right is the cause of manifest harms, either for an entire society or for a particular community. Economic freedom is a natural right is a pretty poor argument for someone who believes that the market is to blame for his community's plight. Again, witness support for Trump and for Sanders. And this reaction reflects an insight, which I think is basically sound, that economic freedom is meant to serve the human good and not vice versa. So if, and this is an important if economic freedom does create bad outcomes for communities, that should give us pause in defending it. It should prompt us to ask whether a particular scheme for protecting liberty has gone awry or needs to be conditioned or directed or compensated for in some way. The utilitarian argument for economic freedom suffers similar defects. And we can leave aside for today the fact that utilitarianism, like all forms of consequentialism, is strictly speaking intellectually incoherent. It tells us to pursue the greatest good as if all goods were on a single scale and hence readily commensurable. Even if we did have knowledge of all of the consequences of our actions, which we can't, there's no way of saying how many books are worth how many works of art compared to how many moments of divine contemplation or how many widgets produced at a factory. And of course, consequentialism itself provides no standard at all of what should count as a good consequence, which is why it so frequently is accompanied by sheer preference satisfaction or hedonism. But in a corrupt culture, there's no reason to think that satisfying any given preference is actually good, nor that people take pleasure in the right things. And by submitting every individual's most basic interest to a cloudy vision of the good of the collectivity, consequentialism makes nonsense of the idea of basic rights. That is why consequentialist arguments for economic freedom suffer the same sort of defects as the natural rights without foundations approach. They aren't true, and they aren't persuasive precisely in the respect in which they're not true. That a certain economic regime will produce the greatest good for the greatest number overall and in the long run says nothing at all about the justice or injustice of specific communities who might foot the bill, of sacrificing their good as a means to our social goals. Which is precisely why the argument fails to persuade. That a given trade policy will raise the GDP is cold comfort to people who believe that their town's way of life will be destroyed. If groups of people systematically bear the costs of creative destruction disproportionately, don't be surprised if the losers resent the winners. Again, witness support for both Trump and Sanders. Another way of suggesting this, if the upper middle class way of life was threatened by globalism, open borders immigration, and new labor-saving robotic technologies, it wouldn't have taken Brexit or a Trump victory before the chattering classes took seriously the costs of such innovations and how they were being distributed. Now, this isn't to say that the policies proposed by Trump or Sanders would solve these problems. It's simply to say that our one crisis of liberty in the West lies in some of the dominant visions of liberty and the foundations and therefore the scope. Axiomatic, natural right-based arguments and utilitarian arguments get the issues wrong and they fail to persuade. And the failure of these dominant accounts contribute to the public reaction against economic freedom. The public doesn't find our case for economic freedom compelling. So let me move on. Second, bad intellectual arguments aren't the only culprits. So too is a collapsed civil society. Michael Novak, who this award is named for, got it exactly correct when he said that a free society requires both free economies and free polities, but also robust moral cultures to undergird the economic and political orders. Why do so many small business owners complain about how hard it is to find reliable workers? People who will come to work every day on time and actually do their work. Why are so many governments on the verge of bankruptcy because of out-of-control entitlement spending? It's a cultural breakdown that's part of the blame for our political mess and economic challenges. So it's not just the ideas that matter then. The crisis of liberty in the West isn't simply a matter of deficient intellectual defenses of liberty. It's also a crisis of real society, a crisis of community and solidarity, a crisis of truth and virtue. This matters for at least two reasons. First, and in general, strong civil society is a requirement for limited government and hence for liberty. Strong families and religious communities place a check on the state, and they make liberty and self-government possible. Families and religious communities first create and then raise the next generation of law-abiding, economically productive members of society. We all need non-governmental, non-market institutions to create people who can flourish in a free society, people who have the habits of heart and mind to flourish under the conditions of freedom. When this doesn't happen, when families fail to form or break down prematurely, when citizens fail to receive an education and a moral formation in real human virtue, that's when we see welfare states explode and unemployment rise. That's when we see an increase in crime, drug addictions, fatherless children, and a host of other social ills. This is what simultaneously creates people unable to flourish and governments that try to respond but frequently make matters worse. But second, and more specifically, and in particular, crises we face today, strong civil society helps people weather the storms that are distinctive of our current moment in economic history. Globalization, free trade, new technologies can all be best harnessed for the good when our institutions of civil society are strong. In ages past, strong religious communities and moral traditions might have provided guidance in how to think about the best use of new technology. The computing and digital revolutions have been mixed bags, but we're particularly ill-equipped to harness these technologies for good, for true liberty, because we don't even know how to think about them, because we don't have robust intellectual traditions and communities of virtue. We also don't have the support networks in terms of families and guilds and non-extortionist unions, fraternal organizations, support networks to help people weather the storm of globalization. If the benefits and burdens of free trade and new technologies and globalization in general have been unevenly spread, those on the losing side of things are particularly ill-equipped to handle it because their communities are in shambles. Weak civil society makes it harder for people to make the transition from a labor-based economy to an information economy. Add to this our class division on the basis of marriage between those who were born to and raised by their married mother and father, with all the developmental advantages that that brings, and those who were not. And it isn't surprising that many in the West feel more economically insecure than ever before. We don't have the communities that make liberty and security possible. But let me move on to cronyism. Because rightly sensing the limits of the natural rights and utilitarian approaches to economic freedom, and seeing a decaying culture and a fraying civil society, some thinkers are quick to place the blame on economic and political freedom themselves. They blame what they call liberalism or capitalism. But if you're criticizing modern-day Western European political economic systems or modern-day America, you're not criticizing classical liberalism or free economies. For Western Europe and America don't have free market economies or classically liberal polities. Many of these criticisms are actually that are being leveled at free markets are in reality directed at the exact opposite. They're really directed at crony capitalism, the collusion of big business and big government, frequently aided and abetted by big media and big law. Businesses that are too big to fail, that rig the economic system in their favor, that hire the best lobbyists to get government to regulate their industry in their favor, to create barriers to entry for competitors and newcomers, to weaken the labor market. Cronyism takes place whenever these groups collude to set up the system against the little guy and the new guy, when they go outside of transparent, normal operating procedures to get a result in their favor at the expense of the common good. In the economic realm, you see this with large corporations that get the government to create thickets of regulations which only they know how to navigate and which frequently they're exempt from, that then prevent smaller, more local firms from competing. You see it too when teacher unions and government-run schools create licensing requirements to prevent new teachers from joining the workforce and create local government-run monopolies on education while blocking school choice. The education example quickly leads to another form of cronyism, what I've called cultural cronyism. Cultural cronyism is when the bigs collude to use their outsized influence to reshape the culture against the common good. It's when elites use their power in non-democratic, non-accountable ways to force social change on ordinary people. It occurs when the Supreme Court redefines marriage or strikes down laws protecting unborn babies. It occurs when federal agencies make people of faith pay for abortion or perform sex reassignment surgeries. It occurs when the NBA and the NCAA, when Apple and Salesforce boycott a state because the citizens favor a policy that the elites dislike. Cultural cronyism takes place whenever the cultural left can't win an honest debate and vote, and thus they force social change through sheer power. Now, whether it be crony capitalism or cultural cronyism, conservatives should see that the threat isn't primarily voluntary exchange in markets, but government meddling to favor moneyed special interests. Not classically liberal constitutions, but court rulings that upset constitutional procedures. Supporting market economies need not entail supporting the business class. And supporting constitutions need not entail supporting judicial activism and rule by lawyers. It's thus by being more faithful, not less, to classical liberal constitutional principles that we can eliminate the unfair advantages that cronyism creates. After all, market freedoms, while not axiomatic, do play an essential role in promoting human flourishing. Freedom of contract and freedom of association can foster real human goods. Constitutionalism, governments of limited and enumerated powers, separation of those powers, checks and balances, the rule of law, and other hallmarks of classical liberalism all help secure justice and promote the common good. They're a recognition, as Lord Acton taught, that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Witness what happens with unaccountable bureaucrats in the departments of health and human services, or for that matter, in Brussels or Geneva. Thus, classical liberal forms of government are not simply the result of Enlightenment liberal philosophy. They are the fruit of Enlightenment thought, along with classical ideas and ideals, medieval political thought, and the common law tradition. To take my own tradition, the American founding is a lot more than just John Locke, although many of these critics will criticize the American form of government for simply being a result of mistaken Enlightenment ideas. So let me move to the second, the constructive half of the lecture. I've mentioned flawed intellectual defenses of freedom and the potential for overreaction in our critiques of them. What then is the alternative? I've hinted that the alternative focuses on arguments about what freedom is for. a freedom for excellence, on how freedom serves the common good and thus is limited by it as well. But any theory, any sound theory at least, of the common good needs to rest on a theory about what is good for people who are to live in common. Any sound theory about what is good for people needs to take seriously their nature. In a word, or in two words, what we need to rediscover are the natural law arguments for liberty. Such arguments ground the rightness of economic liberty in human nature and how liberty enables human flourishing. They take seriously man's nature to labor for his keep and how people should ordinarily interact with one another on a voluntary basis, how we must work together to meet human needs, and how such coordination and togetherness should ordinarily be achieved through free associations and free exchanges. Contrary to some voices on the left, government isn't the primary word for what we do together. We have other words for that: civil society, church, charity, small business, large corporation. Those are how we normally work together. Natural law arguments take seriously man's nature as a self-directing, freely choosing agent and concludes that man needs the space and the room to determine himself. More than a Lockean self-owner, they see man as a self-author. And it's by exercising freedom of economic initiative and freedom of exchange that people ordinarily author their lives. But if freedom in general, and if economic freedom in particular, are grounded in man's nature and how such freedom allows man to flourish given his nature, then freedom is directional. It has a purpose. It's not a freedom from constraint or a freedom of indifference to human choices and outcomes, but a freedom for excellence, a freedom for flourishing. In short, natural law arguments strike a balance. They're sensitive to the role that markets can play in fostering initiative and innovation, creating jobs, and lifting people out of poverty. But they aren't blind to the damage that market activity can cause. Natural law arguments look to the demands of justice and the ways in which liberty can both foster and undermine the common good. They take seriously the rights of property owners, but also their duties in stewarding their wealth. This, in turn, provides an intellectual framework for thinking both about the justifications and the limits of economic liberty, and the reasons that we might be concerned with market failures or excesses. This means defenses of freedom can't be morally neutral, agnostic, or skeptical about the content of human flourishing. This also means that we as market actors need to have true morality inform our market behavior and not allow advertising, marketing, new technologies to shape our values. There's a world of difference, after all, between a society with a market and a market society. America's founders were able to recognize this truth when they distinguished liberty from license. You can see this in what the founders say about the limits of markets. For the founders, there would be no markets in killing, whether that be abortion or physician-assisted suicide. No markets in sex, no markets in illicit drugs. There are some things money shouldn't buy. The inability of modern progressives to distinguish liberty from license is one of the great threats to real liberty in the West today. Progressive defenses of license under the guise of liberty have played a significant role in the destruction of families, religious congregations, and civil society writ large. And so a failure to defend rightly ordered liberty has left an entire generation morally adrift, unable to harness freedom for the good. Since I've said a few words on natural law and economic freedom, let me say a few words about natural law and a natural law conception of social justice. So this is the second subheading within the second half of the lecture. Some people think social justice is a 20th century innovation of left-leaning thinkers. But this starts the history of the phrase social justice midstream. To understand its true meaning, we need to look further back to its real historical origins. The first usage of the phrase social justice that we know of is by a Jesuit Thomist, Luigi Tapparelli, in his multi-volume work published between 1840 and 1843 titled A Theoretical Treatise on Natural Law Resting on Fact. I want to emphasize just two arguments that Tapparelli highlights by coining the new phrase social justice. First, that man is social by nature and belongs to many societies. And second, that man has natural duties to others in justice. So first, Tapparelli creates the phrase social justice to highlight there are societies between individuals and governments. He wanted to avoid both the individualistic and the collectivistic temptations. He wanted to point out that the truth was somewhere in between. He wanted to highlight that as a matter of nature, man is a social being, and that this places duties on individuals. Duties people have to their families, to their churches, to their community. It also therefore places limits on government. Government is limited by the reality of the natural family. Government is limited by the prerogatives of religious communities. That government is limited by the authority of local communities. But I want to focus on the duties, because one aspect of the crisis of liberty in the West is that we no longer realize we have unchosen duties. A sound understanding of our duties, however, gives us one of our best reasons for respecting liberty, to have the freedom to fulfill our duties. This, after all, is precisely how James Madison understood religious liberty. As James Madison wrote in his remarkable Memorial and Remonstrance, he writes, quote, "The religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, because of a prior duty to seek out the truth about God and the created order." So Madison continues, "What is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society." Indeed, one can understand many of the religious liberty threats in the West today as partly the result of people no longer thinking there are duties to the Creator. No special duties to God, no special religious liberties either. Something similar may be the case for the economy. Economic freedom is meant to give us the space to fulfill our economic duties. The duty to work hard to support our families. The duty to work hard as an employee, being a good employee so as not to waste our talents or our boss's time and money. The duty to serve our customers, the duty to serve our communities. Economic freedom was to allow people the space to fulfill these duties. Social justice is about fulfilling our duties to the various societies of which we're a part. It's not about the government creating a big redistribution machine. It's about the state respecting the authority of the many societies that make up civil society. Take, for example, the society known as the family. The family is a natural society with its own nature and integrity. Because of the natural reality of the family, we have certain obligations. If you're a husband or a wife, you have certain duties to your spouse. If you're a parent, you have certain duties to your children, regardless of whether or not you ever chose them. And children, not Social Security administrators, have duties to their parents, especially as they age. It's the natural realities of father and child, mother and child, that create the relationships of both authority and responsibility. This then places limits on what the government can do. The government is not free to recreate the family. The government's not free to usurp the authority of parents over the education of their children, or usurp the authority of adult children over the care of their elderly parents. The same is true for religious organizations, especially if you believe that your church has a divine origin, if it has a divine creation. So government is not at liberty to recreate it, to recreate its authority structure, to recreate its teaching authority. That's something that the church has been entrusted with as a stewardship. And so the nature of religious authority places limits on political authority, places duties on us as members of a church. None of this, however, is to say that the state has no role to play in economic justice. just that it must respect the proper authority of society, a society of societies, as it does so. And this also means that it must respect the proper authority of economic societies, employees and employers, consumers and producers. But while respecting this authority and the markets that allow them to interact and fulfill their duties, government can perform certain welfare activities, as Hayek taught us, provided they don't distort market signals and processes. Indeed, insofar as government programs that are intended to ameliorate the forces of globalization or new technologies do distort markets, they're likely to simply make matters worse by prolonging the dying process of outdated industries and by preventing the necessary transitions that need to take place within the labor force. What a natural law account of social justice suggests are policies that would empower more people to engage for themselves in the market to flourish. And I can illustrate this with some examples. Consider education. So this is an example that will come from Friedman. Some taxation is theft libertarians say children should receive whatever education their parents, extended families, and charities can provide, but there's no role for governments. Liberals say education is a matter of public concern, and therefore government should run schools. Conservatives have traditionally struck a balance. We've said, yes, education is a matter of public concern, but that justice requires us to respect the authority of parents, and that whatever assistance we provide must empower, not replace them. Hence, conservative support for school choice, vouchers, education saving accounts, and charter schools, programs that help all students get the best education they can without giving government unhealthy monopoly over education. The same is true for healthcare. If taxation is theft, then we should just leave healthcare to the market and charities. If healthcare is a matter of public concern, then government should run it and finance it. Those are the typical libertarian and liberal pitfalls. The conservative alternative has been markets in healthcare while empowering patients to choose, whether that be through premium support, healthcare vouchers, tax credits, or what have you. The details of the policy wonkery need not bog us down. The concept is what matters. We need to make markets work better and work for more people by empowering more people to be market actors, empower more people to take control of their own lives to flourish. And so now, to my mind, the question is what can be done for working class families, especially for the workers, who find their skills are less and less marketable in ever-changing markets because of the forces of globalization and new labor-saving technology. It strikes me that appeals to natural rights or utilitarianism won't allow us to best think through the justice in the distribution of costs and benefits of the creative destruction of free trade, and how best to smooth out any rough patches. What we need to do is think through the appropriate roles of various institutions. What does justice require of families and churches, of workers and business owners, of civil society and charitable organizations, of local and national governments? What rights and duties do these various individuals and societies have? In a certain sense, the economic challenges I've mentioned can be classified as partly the result of de-industrialization. So if Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which inaugurated modern Catholic social thought, was a response to the Industrial Revolution, what we now need is a response to the de-industrial revolution. What to do is a question for policymakers. That we need to think about what to do is a demand of justice, and the principles of natural law should inform how we think about it. So let me now move to the last section. But the challenges of the present moment can be overstated. They can be phrased in a way that makes it seem as if globalization and new technologies simply leave people as pawns in a giant chess game, as victims of global economic and technological forces outside of anyone's control. This entirely ignores the importance of human agency and personal responsibility. Public policy and governmental programs are not, at the end of the day, the main solutions to what threatens freedom in the West. Yes, economic anxiety is a problem, But economic anxiety is partly a result of an underlying anthropological and spiritual crisis that has resulted in an emaciated civil society. I mentioned at the beginning the empty pews and the drug addictions, the problems of falling male employment and the breakdown of the family that results in fatherless children, and the widespread belief that there's no truth, particularly moral truth. Some of these problems have been caused by various economic and technological changes in the past several decades. But I'm not a Marxist, and the changes in our values and beliefs are not simply the result of material forces. Some spiritual crises are simply the result of bad ideas and bad ideals. And these bad ideas and ideals have exacerbated our economic challenges. Bad anthropology has given us natural rights without foundations or directions, a freedom of indifference but not for excellence. Bad anthropology has debased modern man's mind so that it's unable to distinguish liberty from license, rendering man unable to think about which desires should be acted on, which preferences should be satisfied. Bad anthropology has sought to liberate man from the very communities where he finds meaning and purpose, alienating man from work, from family, and from God. The result is a working class without the values and virtues to flourish in the condition of freedom, and a ruling class more devoted to a global community than to their own communities. The result is a working class increasingly isolated from meaningful relationships and thus more anxious about their futures, and a ruling class increasingly isolated from their working class neighbors and thus unaware of their anxieties. The result is a nation, both working class and ruling class, that increasingly lacks a transcendent orientation and thus fails to even have a decent humanistic vision. If we don't have God for a father, we won't see our fellow man as our brother. If we aren't made in the image and likeness of God, we won't treat every life as created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. Indeed, we'll view our neighbors as random, meaningless, cosmic dust that sometimes gets in our way. The challenge before us, then, is to recover at the very least a common understanding of what human flourishing looks like and how all of us should help to make it a reality for more people. It requires a better intellectual foundation for freedom. It requires the hard work of rebuilding civil society. It requires acknowledging our duties not to abstract humanity, but to concrete neighbors. And it will require respecting the freedom of religious communities to do the important work of ministering to the peripheries and forming disciples with loyalties beyond the nation state. This means that now is the time for more engagement in the public square, not less. Now is the time for greater involvement in our local church and synagogue and mosque, for greater involvement in our schools and little leagues. And now is the time for more political engagement, not less, and pursued more thoughtfully. Let me close by suggesting that everything I've said this afternoon has been a reflection on man's nature as a dependent, rational animal, in the words of the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre. First, we're animals. We have a nature. Certain things are good for us and bad for us, given the type of animal that we are. Second, we're rational. We can know our nature and direct our actions accordingly, or not. We don't get to choose what is good for us and bad for us. We simply get to choose whether we will live in accordance with our nature. And then third, we're dependent. We are social creatures. We enter life entirely dependent on our parents, and many of us will exit life in a similar condition of dependency. And all along the way, we will depend on our family, our friends, our neighbors, and our colleagues, and on farmers and artisans and merchants and bankers. Our mistakes take place when we forget that we are simultaneously dependent and rational and animal, when we reduce ourselves merely to the level of animal and embrace accrued materialism, when we deny that reason can know truth and embrace skepticism, when we refuse to embrace our dependency under the illusion of either a false sense of self-sufficiency and individualism or when we locate our dependency primarily on government rather than on family and friends and markets. When we propose that the government provide for all of our physical needs and that our culture encourage us to act on all of our animal instincts. We must see that our rational capacities can know the good, and that being self-authors, we must choose the good for ourselves. Of course, there's no such thing as the good life, but as many good lives as is imaginable. And these good lives will be various ways for dependent rational animals to flourish. And that means initiative and enterprise and free choice and self-determination are just as truly basic needs as food and shelter. And that fulfilling our duties to others is the entire point of having the freedom to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for that fine lecture and all of the insights that it contained. We have a few moments for some questions. This is where you get the opportunity to make Dr. Anderson earn this check I'm about to give him. So we have the microphone, and I'll let you choose the...
Norman Backrack. What chance is there that the world could be united as long as there are several very powerful competing religions within it? I don't need to go into all the details. Sure. You can hardly open a page of the Quran without finding what God is going to do to the infidels, and Christianity itself has its record of divisions. So is it not possible that a secular states where they do not, like the United States, where there is no state religion, is in fact the model for future world, although it's severely argued against by Islamists, for example, and others. But don't you think that is a humanist vision? It's the only one that can in fact accommodate all humans without distinction.
Great question. I have two thoughts. The first response is to say that the world is capable of peacefully coexisting with lots of different competing religions, provided all of those religions embrace the natural law and respect the natural rights of all of humanity. So religions that are compatible with the natural law, that respect people's basic rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they can all coexist with each other. It's only when religions violate the natural law and violate people's natural rights that we're going to see conflicts. So then the second part of your question, the second part of my response, is that I think one model of how that can work, it's probably not the only model, but one successful model of that is a formal separation of church and state, but not secularism. So I wouldn't phrase it the way you phrased it. The American founding is a political secular nation in the sense that there's no government-run church, but it was a freedom for religion. They understood the freedom of religion, the free exercise of religion, to be at the service of people leading their religious lives. That religion would flourish if government didn't meddle in it. And you actually see that, I think one reason why religion is flourishing in America in a way that it's not in Western Europe, especially in countries that had established state churches, is precisely the freedom that that created. I don't think that's the only model, but I think that is one model where we can actually find peaceful coexistence while disagreeing on certain theological matters, but agreeing on certain philosophical foundations, like natural rights and natural law.
Someone else.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Anderson. That was a really great lecture. I agreed with every word of it. But I just want to ask you a question about John Locke, which is that you were slightly critical of him, but is it not the case that he believed in God, he was an Orthodox Christian, he wrote this book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. He would have agreed with you about the link between belief in God, the truth of Christianity, belief in an absolute moral law, and he would have been totally opposed to philosophical and moral relativism. And so his arguments about self-ownership would surely have also been rooted in Christian natural law. So he's really on your side, isn't he?
That is the precise location of an enormous scholarly debate. So to a certain extent, my criticism here was of the Lockeans, not of John Locke. Because many of the Lockeans, they reject his divine workmanship argument, and they only focus on his self-ownership argument. And it's chapter 5 of the second treatise where all of this, the interpretive work gets played out. And the Straussians have different Straussians have different, there's an East Coast and a West Coast read of John Locke on this. There's the Cambridge School read of Locke. I take no position on which is the authentic Locke. But the Locke that you just described, which is more or less what I would describe, it's the Cambridge School view of Locke, would be entirely comfortable with many, if not all, of the things that I said in this lecture. There's a certain type of Locke that sees him as a proto-libertarian. Now, Locke was a classical liberal. He wasn't a libertarian. But the reading of Locke where the self-ownership kind of rules everything at the exclusion of divine workmanship, at the exclusion of the reasonableness of Christianity, the things you mentioned, that would be the target of my criticism today.
It was a wonderful lecture. I just want to take a slight issue with
Please.
your libertarian position on education. And I mean, there's no doubt, or even healthcare, right? There's no doubt that some libertarian would say the libertarian position is no government and education at all. But professional libertarian, as you know, I mean, in
It was Milton Friedman's idea.
Yeah, first, I think libertarian can claim Friedman to some extent, and also like the professional libertarians, I mean, they defend school choice just way more strongly than privatization of education. I do have a question. You talked about no market in killing, no market in abortion. Markets, there's this remarkable things that actually manage to prevail even in the form of prohibitions and so I just kind of like, as much as sometimes I like the idea, right, I just kind of wonder how do you really achieve, I mean, that goal. I think it's just, I mean, communist regimes have actually kind of like never managed to squash markets. They're not, our ideal functioning markets, but so I just would like you to expand on this.
Yeah, both points, great questions. Let me start with on the first one, what I was trying to do, and I was probably too subtle, by mentioning Milton Friedman's name at the beginning of my remarks about school choice, I was actually trying to show that many of the iconic libertarians are better than libertarian dogma. Sometimes we're better than our theories. And so the strict kind of Ayn Randian taxation is theft version of philosophical libertarianism would say that both Hayek and Milton Friedman were squishes, because Hayek was in favor of a guaranteed minimum basic income, or at least outside of the market, certain provisions, because Friedman was in favor of government-funded vouchers for education, which is a way of saying that, to the first part of the talk, that some of our defenses of freedom, I think, go awry because we're trying to prove too much, and people find that unpersuasive. If your conception of liberty means that a school choice voucher is a violation of justice, you're probably not going to persuade families who are receiving vouchers to escape public schools, that what they're doing is unjust. So that was what I was trying to accomplish there. On the second point, I think here we can learn a lesson from Aquinas. Aquinas says the law can't penalize every vice, and that you don't want it to penalize every vice. But Aquinas says the law should try to discourage the most egregious vices and the vices that cause the most social harm. So how you do this as a policy matter is that right now in the United States, only 5 states allow physician-assisted suicide. So consider markets and killing. Was it yesterday or the day before, Belgium euthanized a man suffering from alcoholism. And they allowed alcoholism to be the justification for euthanasia. That this was a terminal case of alcoholism. None of the therapies had proven effective. I think that we somewhere should be able to draw a line between what counts as legitimate medicine and what doesn't. And if you think physicians shouldn't kill their patients, it's not that hard to enforce that sort of a rule. There might be black markets in killing, but we won't normalize assisted suicide and euthanasia as elder care. And right now, thankfully, that's not how we've... what was the movie? Was it The Giver? that came out maybe a year or two ago about, it started out as a book when I was a child, so maybe 20, 30 years ago, a book titled The Giver, and then they made it into a movie a year or two ago. And it was about a society at which when you reached a certain age, you were just offed. You were just euthanized. Having markets and killing in that sort, and even if you could protect autonomy, which I think you can't. I think one of the experiences in Belgium and the Netherlands is that autonomy is not respected, and that many depressed, elderly, infirmed individuals are pressured into committing suicide, or even worse, doctors make this decision on behalf of incapacitated patients. So consent is never given. I think a bright line saying doctors may not kill is one way in which we can protect both the integrity of medicine, so we have flourishing markets in medicine but not markets in killing, and protect the autonomy of elderly, infirm, depressed people. But it has to be done prudently. I mean, I think this is Aquinas' point that you can't try to say we're not going to allow markets in any form of vice. We have tons of markets in vice, and we don't think they should be criminalized. But the worst forms of vice, like killing, it might be a point of contention about what counts as an illicit drug. Right? Most people who are in favor of legalizing marijuana aren't in favor of legalizing cocaine. So where to draw that line? What counts as illicit sex that should we have markets in prostitution? That's where I think the grosser forms of vice, the state does have an effective role at limiting, curtailing.
Thank you very much. Councillor Barry McLeod-Clennan, I'm actually one of those politicians that various presenters have raised questions about earlier. One of the things that I would like just to pick up on is this, the language that you're using about sort of markets for killing and so on. We've got a difficult enough job trying to convince people that actually markets are good things, that create wealth, that create opportunities. When we sort of kind of start blurring the lines with this sort of terminology you've just been using just now, it's really very difficult because what you're talking about is institutional rules. They're not necessarily sort of a market in the sense of buying and selling things. That we've got to be very careful about how we're terming that. Sort of customs or practices or laws or rules. These are probably more useful to define what you're discussing here, because it's not as if someone's actually purchasing sort of been sort of killed in say Belgium. It's a rule that's been applied, and often by sort of state pressures or by sort of choices. So I think we need to be really, really careful. Otherwise, you undermine a lot of the other good work and the comments that you're making in this. And I think that actually this is where working with the sort of politicians to actually identify good practices so that we can then sort of make arguments. Look, school choice works. It raises standards. Sort of legalizing sort of drugs reduces social harm, sort of reduces sort of damage done to our sort of legal process and so on. That's perhaps a better way of approaching this.
So I think we might disagree on this, because I do think that what's taking place when someone pays a doctor to kill them is a market transaction in killing. So I do think that's a market in killing. I think what Planned Parenthood does is an entire market industry in killing. You go in when you're pregnant and you pay them money so that you go out and you're no longer pregnant. What took place in between? A baby was not delivered, a baby was killed. And so I think I intentionally use the language of markets and killing, markets and sex, precisely to show that there are some things that we shouldn't buy. Right? There are certain human goods and human practices that are actually corrupted by being exchanged for a price. And you think family relationships, we don't buy and sell children, we don't buy and sell sex, or at least we shouldn't do those things. To say that we shouldn't have markets in everything. Michael Sandel has written an interesting book on this. I think it's titled What Money Can't Buy or What Money Shouldn't Buy. He's a political theorist at Harvard. I don't agree with all of it. I wrote a friendly but critical review of it, I think for the Weekly Standard. But so I used that phrase advisingly. And the only other comment I'll add is that we've already seen in the United States insurance companies where assisted suicide has been legalized, sending letters to cancer patients saying, we can't afford to cover your chemotherapy, but we can cover your assisted suicide drugs. That's a market in killing. And there will be financial incentives to provide the more cost-effective therapy which will be a lethal dosage, than a life-saving therapy. And so I think we do need to recognize some of the limits of market thinking and where it doesn't apply and where it does apply.